This is Dr. Kraus, and I'd like to offer this PowerPoint for you, the study that we want to do for New Testament Survey class on the Gospel of Mark. In the history of the study of the New Testament, Mark has usually been given less attention than all the others have. A lot of people saw it as a condensed version of Matthew. And this is seen, we mentioned in class, in the ordering of the Gospels in our Bibles that are listed by what the editors thought would be the oldest to the newest in the view of what they had from ancient evidence. So it is also the shortest with the most copied material. Most of its material is found in one of the other Gospels. So the statistics on that are pretty interesting. Mark has 661 verses. About 500 of those, by my count, are paralleled in Matthew in some way, not exact language, but about 76%. And then about 250 of the Mark verses are paralleled in Luke, and those aren't all the same verses as in Matthew. So about 38% of the material in Mark is also found in Luke. In fact, of the 661 verses, only 31, again by my count, would be unique verses. Less than 5% of the material of Mark is only found in the Gospel of Mark. But as we mentioned in the other video about the synoptic problem, this position has been reversed because of the two-source theory for the synoptic Gospels that would say that Matthew and Luke both used Mark in their composition, and this other document that scholars sometimes call Q, meaning the source document, that was a collection of sayings of Jesus. So this is the famous Mark-on priority, meaning that when we hold to this idea, Mark becomes the oldest and in some ways the most important of the four Gospels because of its antiquity. The authorship of the book, we will look at two sorts of things when we discuss authorship. First, internal evidence, meaning what does the book say within it, within the pages of the book about the author. Well, the book is anonymous. We'll look at one little piece of internal evidence later, but there is no author claimed here. So really we have to consider external evidence, meaning the tradition and the claims made in the tradition about the author of the book. All the tradition that says anything about this book would say that the author was John Mark. And who is this guy? Well, he's the son of Mary of Jerusalem. This is the person in Acts chapter 20 who owns the home where Peter goes after he's released from prison. Mary of Jerusalem. We don't know what else to call her. She is one of several Marys in the New Testament. He is also listed as a companion of Peter, or of Paul and of Barnabas on the first missionary journey. And we see at the end of Acts 15 that when Paul and Barnabas talk about going on another missionary journey, they have a big fight because of Mark, and Paul does not want to take him. There is some theory that this is because Mary is the perhaps sister of Barnabas, and that John Mark is Barnabas's nephew. He is later listed as a companion of Peter, and is perhaps with Peter in Rome. This seems to be the case in the book of 1 Peter. At the end of the book, 1 Peter 5:13 mentions Mark being with Peter. So our conclusion on all of this is something like this when it comes to authorship. This is my conclusion, that in the city of Rome, Mark composes his book, and it's composed, at least part of the book is based on things he's heard from Peter, or even the preaching of Peter. But we should be careful here. It was never understood in the early church as the Gospel of Peter. It was also always the Gospel of Mark. Um, a little bit of tradition here. There is a very early church father by the name of Papias writing about AD 125, and let me just read his quote about this. And the presbyter said this: Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote down accurately all that he remembered. It was not, however, in order of the things done or said by Christ that he related them, for he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who accommodated his message to the necessities of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a regular narrative of the Lord's sayings. So what Papias is saying, and this is AD 125, so this is less than a century after the time that Mark writes, what Papias is saying is that Mark isn't trying to do chronological order. It's more of a topical order based on the preaching of Peter. So it begins at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus and ends with his death and resurrection, but the internal part isn't really trying to be in strict chronology. But going on, Mark made no mistake in thus writing some things as he remembered them. For of one thing he took special care, not to omit anything he had heard, and not to put anything fictitious into the statement, which is somewhat comforting. I've got here several early ideas of who this one might be. I want to read one more for you, though, from the tradition. This is from a source that we call the Old Latin Gospel Prologues. Listen carefully here. This is from about AD 150, or maybe a little later than that, so maybe 100 years or so after the time that Mark writes. And this is its tradition. It says, Mark related, and then a little parentheses here, who was called Stump Finger, because for the size of the rest of his body, he had fingers that were too short. So you get this incredible nickname of Mark. He's called Stump Finger. Is this some kind of genetical defect, or had he lost, had he had his fingers cut off, or were they just really short fingers? But anyway, this says he was the interpreter of Peter after Peter's death. The same man wrote the gospel in the regions of Italy. I mentioned before, there's this very interesting side note. Of the 31 unique verses in Mark, 31, two of them are right here in Mark chapter 14. And this is a little appendage that is told of the story of the arrest of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And none of the other Gospels have these two verses or anything like them, but after they're arresting Jesus and they're trying to grab some other people, you get these two verses. It says, a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. So one of the theories is that this is sort of a cameo appearance of Mark, and the author is inserting him into the text with something that really happened. And I've heard it explained this way, that maybe, it's late spring, it might be pretty hot, he's supposed to be asleep, he's just a teenager, he's maybe like 12, 13 years old, and he's sleeping with the windows open in his house, and he hears this big commotion. He doesn't live too far from the Garden of Gethsemane, as this theory goes, and so he just wraps, he's sleeping naked, he just wraps a sheet around himself, goes out to see what it is. And when they're trying to grab people, it's really dark. They have torches, but it's not very well lighted here. They're trying to grab disciples. They've got Jesus, and he's submitting to them, but they're trying to grab somebody else. And they see this guy on a white sheet or something, and they go over and grab the sheet, and he just lets it go and runs away naked. Just maybe 10, 12, 13-year-old boy. And maybe this is Mark's little story about himself in the book. I don't know. It's kind of interesting, but that's possible, I guess. Who is he writing for? In all of these books, we want to know who the intended readers are. And again, here he doesn't exactly say, but there are some internal considerations that give us some ideas. Let me list a couple of them here. Occasionally, Mark uses a Latin term to explain a Greek word. This is very hard to see in the English translations, but in Greek, he'll be going along in Greek, and then he'll uh, say something. He'll use a Greek word for something, and then he will use an explanatory Latin term. If you want to look at one of these, Mark 15, verse 16, goes like this. And the soldiers led him away inside the hall. And in Greek, this is the aule, the hall. And then Mark adds this comment. He says, that is the praetorium, which is a Latin term, the praetorium. Matthew simply refers to this as the praetorium. He doesn't try to explain it. But Mark uses the Greek term, and then it almost feels like, well, he's dealing with people in Rome that may not know what that Greek term for hall, aule, means, so he wants to give them an equivalent of something from the city of Rome. Another thing that he does is that he often stops to explain Jewish customs and expressions in the book. So in chapter 1, verse 9, he identifies Nazareth as being in Galilee. Okay, well, probably if he's writing in Rome, nobody would have ever heard of Nazareth. This would be like me telling you about a town in Oregon that I know of named Jordan Valley, and probably none of you have ever heard of Jordan Valley. But if I say Oregon, it's in Oregon, you would have some idea where that is. Maybe some of you wouldn't, but most of you would know where Oregon is. It's in the United States on the West Coast in the Pacific Northwest. Well, he's kind of doing that here. Maybe the people in Rome, they don't know where Nazareth is, but they know where Galilee is, so he's giving a little help to them. Another example, in Mark 3:17, he mentions that the James and John are called Boanerges, and then he translates that. Boanerges is an Aramaic word, and he says, which means sons of thunder. A similar example is in Mark 5:41, where Jesus is healing this little girl who has died. He's actually bringing her back to life, and he gives the Aramaic words. He says exactly what Jesus would have said in Aramaic, Talitha Kumi, and then he translates it. He says, which means daughter arise, or little girl get up. So he's helping lend the authenticity of the actual words in Aramaic, and yet knowing his readers aren't going to understand that, he gives them some help. There are some other places where he translates Aramaic expressions into Greek. And another place that's interesting to me, chapter 12, verse 18, he's talking about the Sadducees, and he identifies them by their lack of belief in the resurrection. Now, all of the Jewish people in the ancient world would have known about that. They would have known the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection, but perhaps not the people in the city of Rome. And so Mark is using a little bit of space, even though he's pretty compact in his writing, to explain some things that are Jewish. So all of these combined lead us to believe that Mark was writing for the Christians of the city of Rome, primarily Gentiles, not Jews, and that goes with the tradition. So when was Mark written? And you can read more about some of the theories in the Erdman's Companion. I just want to give you my take. I would think that a date after AD 70 just doesn't make sense. Remember, AD 70 is the destruction of the temple. I don't think, as Mark writes this, there's any awareness that the temple has been destroyed. Now, for example, I really think that Luke, in particular, writes with the idea that he knows there is no more temple in Jerusalem, but not Mark. But there's no mention of the destruction of the temple. In view of the evidence and the connection with Peter, a date that I give you here, about AD 65 through 70, would be reasonable or even likely. Now remember, about AD 65 is when Nero starts these persecutions against the Jews, trying to blame them for burning the city of Rome. I think that's the background of the book. He's writing it at the depth of the persecutions of Nero, And it also helps us see First Peter as a background for the book of Mark. The connections of these New Testament books aren't always as evident as you might have thought they were. First Peter, I think, really helps us sometimes understand Mark. I don't have time to give examples of that, but I really think the two can be read together. This painting, by the way, my family and I saw this on display at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. It is absolutely huge. I mean, this thing's about 8 feet tall and about 16 feet long or something like that, and just very powerful. Very, very powerful. And the way that Jerome leaves it really just kind of pulls at your heart. You see the torches, these are people that they're burning alive and setting on fire, and then you've got this group of Christians that are ready to be savaged by the lions. There's one thing I need to talk about. There's really two places like this I'm going to talk about in this class, and that has to do with the ending of the book of Mark. And as let's just read here a little bit, chapter 16. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But as they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He is risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him, but go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. This is probably the most famous example of what we call a textual variant or textual uncertainty in the New Testament. And the people that study this sort of stuff are called textual critics. We're not using critic in a bad way here. They're just trying to find what really Mark wrote, because there are very old and good manuscripts that end right there. Verse 8 is the end of the book of Mark. They don't have anything after that. Generally, there are very few textual problems in the New Testament, but this is one of them. The New Testament was copied by hand for 1400 years before the printing press, many different scribes, many different parts of the world, and it's not surprising a few textual problems have surfaced. But there are four possible endings to the book of Mark. And one of them you see right here. Some very old and excellent manuscripts end abruptly with chapter 16, verse 8, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. In other words, the issue here is that they're told that Jesus has been risen from the dead by the angel, but they don't see him. There's no encounter with the risen Christ. There are some other manuscripts that add a shorter ending after verse 8. These are also very ancient manuscripts. Let me just read this. It's not very long. It's called the shorter ending of Mark. "But they reported briefly to Peter and those with him all that they had been told. And after this, Jesus himself sent out by means of them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation." So just they go talk to Peter, and then Jesus commissions them to go out and proclaim eternal salvation. I mean, there's not a whole lot there, and nothing new or surprising. A little bit different language, but not very original. A third possibility is this one. This is called the longer ending of Mark, and in all of your Bibles, including the NIV, they will have this somewhere. But if you look, you can look right now in your Bible at verse 9. They will make some kind of a footnote, or sometimes it's at the very end, and say something like, this is these verses, verses 9 through 20, are not in all the ancient witnesses or something to that effect. What they mean is not all the old manuscripts have these verses. And I just have to tell you, I'm not going to take time to read this. You've all read it before, but there are a few things here, and there are some people who are very pro baptism, as even baptism being necessary for salvation, who really want to hold on to these verses. Look at verse 15. He said to them, "Go into all the world, preach the gospel to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned." And we want to use that as a proof text for the necessity of baptism. I by the way, don't think that works. It says if you believe and are baptized, you're saved. It says if you don't believe, you'll be condemned. It doesn't say anything about the person who believes but has not been baptized, which is where the issue is. Do you have to be baptized in order to be saved? It really doesn't address that. But a lot of very conservative people really love that verse, but then they don't want to read any further. Read on a little bit here. "And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will drive out demons." Okay, well, that's not too bad. "They'll speak in new tongues." Ooh, if I'm not Pentecostal, that's scary. "They will pick up snakes with their hands, and when they drink poison, it will not hurt them at all." Snake handlers and poison drinkers? "And they will place their hands on sick people, and they will get well." And so it's like we like some of this longer ending, but we don't like that part. Most people don't want to handle snakes or, this drinking of poison. Literally, in some very fundamentalist churches, they practice this where they will drink, supposedly in a worship time, they get all worked up and they will drink cyanide or something. And this used to happen when we lived in Tennessee, and every once in a while you would hear the news would come out that someone had died either from handling a snake or drinking poison. But I think sometimes they do it. I know they handle snakes. I've seen videos of that. I've talked to people that have been in those services. They have crates with rattlesnakes and they take them out. And even sometimes they're bit by the snakes and they don't die. So that's not for me. I'm not going to do that. But anyway, it's kind of a strange text, and I have to tell you my opinion, and this is nothing more than my opinion. I don't know the answer to this, but when I read this in Greek and I read through verse 8 and then I go to verse 9, you can't tell this quite as much in English, but it feels like somebody else took over. It's not the same author. It just doesn't feel the same, and it's very subjective, but that's just my opinion. There is one other solution. There is a very old manuscript called Codex Washingtonianus, and it's called that, Codex W, because it's in the Smithsonian Institution in one of their museums in Washington, D.C. It's also called the Freer manuscript. It was donated by this industrialist named Freer, Freer, if you want to look it up. But let me read the ending that it puts down. It says, "And they excuse themselves, saying, the age of lawlessness and unbelief is under Satan, who does not allow the truth and power of God to prevail over all the unclean things of the Spirit. Therefore, reveal thy righteousness not." Thus they spoke to Christ. And Christ replied to them, "The term of years of Satan's power has been fulfilled, but other terrible things draw near. And for those who have sinned, I was delivered over to death, that they may return to the truth and sin no more, in order that they may inherit the spiritual and incorruptible glory of righteousness, which is in heaven." So I don't know if you picked up on that. I read it pretty fast, but you get this idea of the age of Satan, and that Christ doesn't quite have authority yet because everything's really under the power of Satan, and the time isn't there. So that's the fourth ending, which doesn't match up with these other ones at all. That ending is only in that one manuscript, but there's a very ancient author by the name of Jerome who knows about this ending. He actually talks about in his time, he's writing about AD 400, about various endings for the book of Mark, and he knows about this ending, this power of Satan ending. So in the end, most scholars have dismissed the longer ending as a later addition on several grounds, and would say that one of two things. Either Mark intended the book to end at verse 8, or if there was more, it's been lost. And that's not terribly surprising. You know, if part of the book would have been lost, the very, very original manuscript, we would think it would be the end of the book, and that's unfortunate. But that's really the conclusion. I'm going to stop here, and there is a second video to go with this that will talk more about the content of the Gospel of Mark.